Hey guys, welcome to lesson number 71 in our series Drawing Techniques for Beginners. Towards the end of the last lesson, we really started developing the midsection area here, this sort of dark reflective area, because we wanted to start increasing the contrast so that this center piece really, reflection, starts to really pull forwards. Now, what I've done in the meantime is I've just started tidying up and darkening some of these areas, and some of you will notice from one of the posts that I put on our Facebook group a few days ago, I discovered a new eraser. It's called the Perfection 7056. It's by Faber-Castell, and it's actually an eraser that you can sharpen like a pencil. Now, I've just been doodling with this in just some of these highlighted areas, and I really do like the way that this lifts off the graphite. If you're following the techniques that I've been teaching, and if you haven't already looked at them, it's called Essential Pencil Skills. If you have a look above you now, there should be a playlist there, and that's lessons 1 to 6. Now, the way in which we're laying down our graphite is we're layering the different grades of pencil from our harder pencils up to our softer pencils, and we're not using a blending stump or any tools to blend and grind the graphite down into the tooth of the paper. And what I find that does is it allows me to really take out some of these finer reflections. Now, when we look at our reference image, within the reflections, you've got some very light reflections and some darker reflections as well. So this has been fantastic. You can get these from Amazon. It's a Faber-Castell. They come in a pack of 2, and I think they cost me £3. So I'm really excited to crack on with that. But without further ado, let's have a go at developing some of this darker area now underneath this wing mirror. That's the area that I want to be focusing on. I'm going to start with the HB pencil, and I will try and get the reference image and the drawing itself in place. So I'm just going to identify this crease here. I'm guessing it's where the door panels meet, and you can tell that this is a very expensive car, because it's the small details like that as I'm looking at this, it's such a slight indentation. It's not your bog standard cut off door frame. It's a very subtle edge to it, and I guess it's partly to do with aerodynamics and things like that. You see with these supercars that they try and get every single last piece of performance out of the car. So things like aerodynamics are one of the things that I guess that they spend an awful lot of time trying to get right, and making these incremental changes to make the cars faster. Thank you so much for coming this far with me. I know I've not posted an actual real drawing for a while. I've recently been doing a lot of digital art. My journey with art really began with wanting to do digital art, and about 4 years ago I did purchase myself an iPad with the pencil, and I got to work on it and realised very quickly that I couldn't draw. So what I decided to do was go and teach myself how to draw traditionally with a pen and a pencil, and it dawned upon me a few weeks ago that actually I maybe ought to try giving some of this digital work a go, and I'm pleased to say that I'm starting to pick it up. So I've put a few posts over on the group, and I've had some nice comments, and it's very tricky understanding the mechanics of digital drawing, but it's something that I'm quite interested in, and I have to become obsessed with things. So I have been spending every spare second of every day learning, watching some tutorials. I've even signed up for a digital art course, which is costing me a little bit of money, not too expensive, but something that, for me, I think that I need to throw myself into it and really become what I'm trying to learn. And for me, that's the best way. It's exactly what I did with the graphite drawing. I literally threw myself into it, and burning the midnight candle, so I'm up quite late, but it pays off, it pays dividends. So yeah, I thought it was better to about time that we cracked on with this I'm told it's a Lamborghini from one of my close friends. We went out for a meal the other evening, and they were talking about one of the drawings that I'd done, and I asked them, I know one of the guys is a bit of a car fanatic, and he assured me that what we're drawing here is a Lamborghini. He thinks it's a Lamborghini Aventador SV, which doesn't mean a huge amount to me. They're a little bit out of my price range, and I must say I'm not a huge car fanatic. So I'm layering this HB pencil down. Now we have got a lot of graphite in here already from the surrounding areas that we've been working on. So that's why I haven't gone in with one of the harder pencils straight away with a 2H or something like that, because we have got that very, very fine layer of graphite in there. Because we've been brushing in so much, we have got that base there already. So I'm not too concerned with having to get this paper conditioned to the same level that we would do if this was a plain piece of paper. And like I say, all of this is covered in my playlist that was above around about the 1 minute 30 mark. So if you wanted to go back to that and just click on that, there's 6 lessons, and it takes you through all of the stages that I use in order to build up a nice contrast in your work, using the different grades of pencils and without the need to blend, which some people find counterintuitive. But when we talk about blending, what we're really talking about is going from one gradient to another, or having a gradient from one value to another. Most people talk about blending as what we would actually call smudging. So whether you're using a tortillon, a paper stump, or you're using your finger, or I've practiced this. I did it initially using Q-tips or cotton buds, the things that we clean our ears out with. What you're really doing there is you're smudging the graphite, and yes, it gives you a smooth gradation, but what it really doesn't do for you is it doesn't allow you the same control that we have if we've laid our graphite down in the way that I'm teaching you. And what that does, certainly for a subject like this, is it absolutely will not let you take the graphite out in those very, very subtle shadowed areas and those very subtle reflective areas. And when we're looking for realism, it's those little bits and bobs that really do propel our drawing forward. So let me position this slightly over. We're still in frame. So I'm going to just now begin work on this darker indentation. And once we get some value into this area, it's absolutely going to give us an indication of how much or how little, how much we need to take out of the surrounding area in order to develop the contrast, because this is the part of this middle section, this door section that has got the most value in there. So this is almost, it's not quite one of the darkest areas, but it's sort of in your top 5 or 6 areas throughout the piece that is containing the most value. So I've just turned my paper so that the stroke that I'm using, I'm still pulling towards me, but I've just turned the paper so that I'm keeping my stroke in line with the direction that I want to go, just for my initial layers. If I want to go back into this later on and just crisscross my lines, because what I'm using is a tapered stroke, it may look as though I'm scribbling on the video, but what I'm doing is I'm doing a series of lines where I'm pulling the pencil towards me, and I'm then removing the pencil and starting back at the top. The tapered part comes into the idea that the start and end of the line are going to be slightly thinner than the midsection. So if you imagine what I'm doing is I'm swooping down onto the paper hitting the paper and then swooping back off. And we're not creating these tails that we sometimes get on our lines where we've pulled off at a slight angle. So we're getting a very, very smooth line, and this becomes very easy for you to blend one line to the next, and it gets rid of those harsh, scratchy, almost like chicken scratches on your paper, which are again very difficult to blend into one another, but they're also very, very difficult to remove. So there's just some details in here now. I'm looking at this slight reflection. Now, as I'm starting to bring value up into some of these darker details, I can see that I've probably got enough value in some of this reflected area, some of this lighter area. So when I start removing some of that with my eraser, I'm going to initially start to remove it with the kneaded eraser. I think you'll find that we're not a million miles away from having the right amount of value in there, which is always a nice bonus because we don't have to overwork this area. These drawings are taking us, they're taking us a good amount of hours. So any areas that we can have to work less in are always going to be welcome in my eyes. So we have these dark lines. I'm not entirely sure what these are representing, but they're certainly a distorted reflection. I don't think that that's a texture on the car. I don't think that they are knobbles and bobbles and the likes in the door. I think this door will be almost mirror smooth. So this is picking up the light that is being reflected from around the room. I watched a series of videos the other day, and it was really, really eye-opening, and it was brilliant to watch. I can't remember exactly who it was that did it, but what it was talking about was something called ambient occlusion and the way that shadows work. Unless you've got a direct light on something, i.e. the sun, if you're in a room without direct sunlight coming in through one of the windows, everything else is illuminated in that room by something called ambient occlusion, and that's the light that's bouncing off of everything else in the environment, and you get a mixture of colours in there. If the walls are blue and the carpet's red, the shadows will contain very, very faint versions of those, and it's how you get these detailed shadowed areas on somebody's face. So yeah, that was a learning curve for me. So that's called ambient occlusion, and it's basically a posh way of saying that things that are further away from the light are darker, and things that are closer to the light source are lighter. That's even including shadows. So a shadow isn't going to just be one bold value, the same value throughout. It's going to get darker the closer it gets to, in the case of a cast shadow, the object that's casting it. And it's going to get fuzzier the further away that it is, and therefore slightly lighter. Okay, so we've got some... I'm going to move up to the 2B pencil now because I think I need to... This is looking like a mid-tone to me at the moment. So I want to just ramp the contrast up and bring this value up slightly more. Now I'm using the same process. If you find that once you've gone over once you've laid a patch of graphite down in one direction, you might sometimes find that the next layer doesn't go on quite as smoothly. What I would suggest to you is just move the paper slightly and just come across it at a different angle. Because what happens is these graphite particles tend to line up very nicely, and that's why we get something called graphite shine. It's one of the reasons why a lot of artists like to use charcoal. Charcoal in itself is a much less uniform substance. The particles that come off of the charcoal stick or the charcoal pencil are much rougher. If you were to look at them under a microscope, graphite are much more uniform and much flatter, almost like the scales on a fish. And that's why using blending stumps and tools to blend creates more graphite shine. We're never going to completely avoid it. In the darkest areas on your drawing, you're always going to have some graphite shine in there, even using the processes that I've used, but it does eliminate it to a large extent, certainly in your mid values, because we're not pressing on too hard and we're not pushing the graphite deep down into the tooth of the paper. Certainly in those mid zones, we don't have any graphite shine. You may find a little bit of the graphite shine in your darker recesses, the darker areas, but certainly not in the light zones and not in the mid values. So I think this is a good opportunity now for me to have a little go with this new eraser. I can just see in between these two values here that we've got a very subtle reflection, a very light reflection. So I'm using this in exactly the same way as the pencil. And I'm not trying to take the graphite out straight away, all of it. What I'm doing is I'm almost reverse layering. And I'm going to use my brush to take away the residue so that I'm not bearing down into the graphite, because again, using an eraser can also embed some of that graphite deep down into the tooth of the paper and make it very difficult to remove completely, if that's something that you need to do. So I'm just identifying now, just at the top of this reflection, which almost looks like a cavity, I'm just identifying a few of these lighter streaks, because the reflections are made up of various different values. We have some very light values in there, mixed in with some mid-tones. Okay, so I need to just revisit where we started off, our initial area. And I'm going to darken that up because we're nowhere near dark enough on this area. And HB is not going to bring the value up enough in that area. I'm just shortening my stroke here. I've quickened it up slightly because I am working in a slightly more constricted area. It's a smaller panel, so I'm speeding the stroke up, but I'm still continuing to layer with the tapered stroke. And then every now and then just giving it a quick brush. And then I'm going to just turn my drawing around slightly, and I'm going to go back over with the HB now, but in the other direction. So I'm almost blending the layers together with the harder pencil. Now if I wanted to, if I feel the need to, I would go back over this with a 2H and blend it all together just to get rid of any imperfections in the lines. You might find, certainly if you're new to this type of technique, that you make some of the lines a little bit too dark, and then other lines you're maybe not positioning quite as close. And it's at this stage here when we're looking at these details that we can get a little bit bogged down with it, and if we're looking at the overall composition we can kind of get a little bit lost and a little bit discouraged. It's very easy to try and see the bigger picture and draw the whole thing, but bear with it, just stick with these small areas. I'm only focusing on this area here. I'm not getting too far ahead of myself, and I know that over time, as I build this up, we will get there. I'm going to now start bringing in some value into this stanchion that's sort of holding the glass in to that quarter panel at the front there. And I'm just starting on the right hand side of it where there is the darkest area, because the light source is coming from this rear side. Anything on this right hand side, if you look at the wing mirror for example, is going to be slightly darker. Now if your reference image that you're using, and I'm not talking about the one we're using here, but let's say you're drawing something else, if your reference image is of poor quality and there isn't a solid light source, you can use your artistic flair and create a light source. So by understanding where your main source of light is it coming from the left, is it coming from the right, is it bottom up or top down? It doesn't take being too technical to be able to implement where the shadows would be. So just look at your drawing and go, okay, well this is sticking out here, so I know that the light will be struggling to get this side of it because it's on the opposite side to the light source, and where would the lighter areas be and where would the darker areas be? And very quickly you can start to bring out some more realism in your drawing that maybe wasn't there in the reference image. I would always suggest to you, particularly if you're doing any commissioned work, make sure that your reference image is as good a quality as you can get, even to the extent where if you're doing a commission for somebody and they're trying to supply you with something, if possible, go and take some photographs yourself of the dog or the person. If not, explain to the client that you're not going to make things up. So the better the reference image, the more information you can get from the reference image, the better job you can make on the drawing. It's also quite helpful, particularly if you're drawing a face or you've been commissioned to do a portrait for somebody. Try and get a few pictures of the person or persons that you're trying to draw from different angles, because what may look like a imperfection of the photograph or a blemish or something like that, when you look at that person from a different angle you actually get to see what it was. So was that a mole on their face, or was that the bone structure underneath their cheek that was causing a shadow to be in a certain area? So I'm just going to brush that in slightly, and I'm going to take out this very subtle reflection going up the length of this. Again, I'm being very careful. I'm not just bearing down and trying to get it completely white straight away. I'm reverse layering. I'm just going to brush the residue off. Now within this shadow there, within the reflection here, we've got some very, very dark areas in there, and we need to bring those up now because that's then going to give us the contrast to work against for the rest of the stanchion. But now we've got those initial layers in there, particularly in the darker regions, it doesn't take much. I'm working with the 2B here. It doesn't take much for you to get to a value that you're kind of happy with. And just making sure that I'm in the right areas. It's very easy in these, it's almost a marbly effect. These reflections are almost a marbled look to them, but it's easy to get lost. It's like when you're trying to draw accurate clouds or something along those lines. Very, very easy to, like I say, get lost and bogged down and become a little bit disheartened with it because it seems like there's never any end to it. Now I've already laid some of these out. There's definitely value in some of these. There's definitely some HB in there. So again, it doesn't take me an awful lot to bring the value up. And I'm layering the 2B and the HB, because I don't want this speckled look that you sometimes get when you're using your harder pencils. If I look at my reference isn't made up of speckledy dots, certainly not under human inspection, just from our eyes. If you looked at it under a microscope, I'm sure there might be a case where the pixels do start to break up, but definitely not from the naked eye. So now I've just started to bring some value into those initial layers, those marbly areas. Now I can start to bring some of the HB down into some of those sort of mid-tony reflections, those lighter greys. And then once I've got some value in there, I think what I'm going to do is, with a little bit of brushing, I'm going to then start to take out some of those patterns with the eraser, the kneaded eraser. The beauty with the kneaded eraser is it really does just lift that first layer of graphite off, so you're getting a very subtle value change. Rather than streaking across it with the Mono Zero or even the new Faber-Castell eraser that I've got, which would then give you quite a harsh look. Tell you what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, if we can see it on the reference, I'm going to bring some value into this area with the HB as well now, just so that I can work from the same sort of base. So any value that I then add, we're working at the same levels. I've got the same value levels. If I just worked in this area first and then manipulated it with the kneaded eraser and then went back into it, I'm going to be working at a different level to what I've got over here. Now I can go over my entire piece here, even those darker areas, because what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be bringing the value up in those areas at the same time. So I'm not going to necessarily be losing those darker reflections. I've possibly got more chance of doing that if I avoid the patches that I've already done. So I'm not being too careful there. I am going over the whole area, and that's how you work a texture. If we'd worked hard on building a texture of wood up or something like that, if we wanted to bring the value up of the whole piece, we would go over all of it together at the same time, and it brings the value up around the textures that you've spent a long time trying to create, but it also brings the value up along the textures, because all you're doing is you're adding more graphite to graphite that's already there. So I'm going to bring up the value around this area in this window. Then I'm going to work quite hard bringing the value up in the darker areas again. So I might even go into the 4B. And then using the brush, I'm going to brush around the value. And that's then going to give me the opportunity to take out some of those highly reflective areas. Been fantastic seeing some of your work over on the Facebook group. We've had quite a few new members, so don't forget to make yourself known. Just say hello to us. The Facebook group's called Tutorial Tuesdays Beginners to Pro. Had a few spammy messages recently, actually. A few members have reported some content, so thank you so much for that. We're trying to keep it a spam-free group. I'm not interested in people posting pictures of lottery giveaways and silly things like that are clearly from either certainly fraudulent or bot accounts and things like that. So just make sure you do request me, or I think it's report it, isn't it? You report them to me and I can get rid of them. No problem. But again, it's nothing major. We've, out of all the art groups that I belong to, whether that's on Facebook or any other social media, then unfortunately, it just seems to be something that's there and prevalent, which is crazy, because we're all there for reasons that aren't necessarily that. If you're interested in that type of thing, I'm sure there are groups out there that you can see that 24/7. So just working this 4B now. Bringing up the value in those very dark reflections. And then, like I said, I'm going to take the brush to it. I'm going to move some of the extra graphite around, certainly into some of those lighter areas, and then I'm going to start removing it with the kneaded eraser, and then possibly the pencil eraser if I need to. Now it's important that what we get here is we're just getting the general shapes of them. We're not adding any of the finer details just yet. And the beauty of this is as well that you would never see these exact same reflections on this car. It only needs to be positioned slightly differently for it to give it a entirely different look. So it's unlike drawing a face that somebody knows inside and out, and we have to get every detail perfect. With this, I'm going to use the 6B now. I'm not really happy with that value. With things like this and hair and whatnot, you're never going to see them the same twice. Clouds as well. Somebody's not going to look at your landscape and say, those clouds weren't in that position on that day at that time, because nobody knows. They're constantly changing. And it's the same here. Different lighting is going to create a completely different look. So as long as we're getting the general shape, because the shapes throughout this are all going to match up and convey the message of the direction that the light's actually coming in. So we don't want conflicting parts of the drawing. We don't want a reflection on the right hand side and then one on the opposite side if that's not really how it looked. I'm taking this 6B now to this stanchion and just bringing the value up there, because I can see that it's nowhere near dark enough. One of those pitfalls that in the past I would have fallen into and been quite happy with it. Okay, so I'm going to give this a brush and then I'm going to show you how I'm going to take some reflections out, and then I think, looking at the time, that should just about do us for today's session. You kind of will get the gist of where we're going with this. So I'm taking my kneaded eraser and I'm just going to freshen this up. I've not freshened it up for a couple of days, so I'm just going to pull it apart and just fiddle with it, and that cleans it up nicely. I've used this one now for, I think, probably about 6 months since we started these Tutorial Tuesdays. I did buy a couple of new Faber-Castell. It's a Faber-Castell kneaded eraser. They're, again, quite cheap over on Amazon. Amazon's the go-to place at the moment for me. Okay, so I'm just making a small point and I'm going to look for some of these lighter areas first. And I am dragging here. I don't normally drag, I normally dab and sort of pat down where I want the value to be removed. But these reflections are quite streaky looking. So I think just moving this eraser in that type of fashion really does lend itself to it. I'm just paying particular attention to where are the lighter zones, because I need to bring those out first. And if you feel you need to just freshen the point up, then absolutely go for that. I can dab a little bit into that area. I've got a streak across here, sort of across the middle. We've also got some sort of mottled looking areas in here. It's possibly the reflections of maybe a light that's above it. Okay, so I'm taking the brush again now and I'm brushing in, and that's going to soften up those areas. And now I'm going to take the new pencil eraser and just really work on some of those very light reflections. It's quite often just the top of a reflection that is slightly lighter. Using the tapered stroke type movement and way of layering, we have got a slightly lighter streak under there. Just reinforce this again, because as we've brushed the value around, we do push it back into some of those lighter areas, and we'll finely tune those. And then I'm going to go back in with the 6B now and just see if I can keep ramping up the contrast, because we've now got some of those lighter reflections to work from. And what I don't really have in there at the moment is I don't have any mid-tone reflections. I've got some of my light areas and I've got some of the darker areas starting to develop, but I can see within there that there are some mid values. So I'll take the HB and I'll just work in some of those areas. And if I want to bring the value up of the whole area, I will just use my tapered stroke over the whole area, making sure that I'm not just working in the light zone, because that will bring it up it will bring the value up in that lighter zone without bringing it up in the surrounding area, which will create an imbalance. Just doing the same fading out to the right of that stanchion. Possibly need a little bit more value over to this right hand side here. Again, just covering that whole patch. So I can definitely see I need more value in this initial stanchion here. So just using that 6B. Okay, so I think looking at the time, we're 40 minutes in. I'm going to leave it there. Continue working in this panel here. I'm going to bring in some of the value below this here because we've got these stark shadows and these reflective areas as well, which I do think will give us then a better idea of what we need to do, if we need to do any more in this window. I'm just going to keep bringing the value up here and just keep messing with those reflections. See how much contrast you can build up. Can you get those darks very dark? Can we keep those highlighted reflections really light? Thanks again for watching. I look forward to seeing how you all get on over on the Facebook group. Don't forget to have a look at my Instagram. That's at ArtisticN1K. You could join the Facebook group. It's Tutorial Tuesdays Beginners to Pro. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and smack the like button. It makes a huge difference at just getting some of my videos out there to people that, you know, maybe want to learn to draw. It's been a pleasure once again, and I look forward to seeing your work over on the group, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching. Hit subscribe, smack the notifications button, follow me on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter.